Hi, everybody. My name is D.Niget, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Angers. I'm a member of the CNRS research center called TEMOS, Temps, Monde, Société, and I'm also a member of a multidisciplinary research project called Enjeux, Enfance et Jeunesse, based in Angers and a few other French Western universities. My research, my personal research, deal with youth delinquency in a gender perspective, and I am currently working on the role of expertise in the juvenile justice system after the Second World War. So, okay, I'm gonna begin my presentation. Emilienne was born in 1938 in Oran, Algeria. Her parents were of Italian origin. In 1939, her father joined the Légion, the military, and then took part in the resistance on the French soil. Emilienne's mother died in 1942. As the father was absent, the two children were placed in the care of the Assistance Publique, which is the administration that cares for orphans and abandoned children. In 1945, at the end of the war, the father took his children back and moved to the Constantine region in Algeria. He remarried a Polish woman whom he had met while he was a prisoner in Germany, with whom he would have 5 children. After the war, family relations were under stress. A report by the social worker who monitors the family states, and I quote, "The disagreements between Emilienne and her parents seems to be mainly due to the girl, whose character has always been difficult," unquote. Emilienne quickly proved to be unbearable, both at home and at school, I quote, where she was reproached for her laziness, her lies, her violence, her early interest in male company, and even for running away, unquote. In 1953, after running away from home, she was placed in the Good Shepherd institution in Algiers, an institution for deviant girls, as a measure of paternal correction, meaning that the father asked the children's judge for her detention order. At the Good Shepherd, she, and I quote, showed herself to be violent, so violent and impulsive that she was considered abnormal from a psychological point of view. She made threats, played with a knife. Twice she escaped, unquote. In 1955, the family left Algeria in a conflictual political context. It was the beginning of the War of Independence. And the family settled then in Maine-et-Loire in France, near Angers. The father was a bricklayer. The family lived modestly, but was not precarious. Emilienne ran away again, and her father once again decided to place her under a paternal correction measure. She was sent to the Good Shepherd in Angers this time for observation prior to a decision by the judge. In front of the nuns and psychologists of the institution, she explained that her father was, I quote, violent and brutal. Her stepmother was a witch whose beauty she admired. And she said, I quote, "I don't want to depend on anyone," she said to justify her need for freedom. At the end of this process, the psychiatric examination report states that she was, and I quote, precociously emancipated girl. She had a strong character. She is often difficult to control and openly shows a desire for emancipation, unquote. And the psychiatrist said she is a caid for ending his reports. She escaped again from the Good Shepherd, and then she was hospitalized in the psychiatric hospital of Saint-James-sur-Loire near Angers. She was 17 years old, and we then lost track of her in the archives. The story of this young girl shed lights on the fate of unruly working-class girls in the mid-19th century. Faced with strong social constraints, complex emotional situations, and even family violence, many girls expressed a desire for emancipation. But this very notion of emancipation, which has a positive connotation today, was still a stigma in the mouth of the psychiatrist in charge of giving an advice to the juvenile judge in Angers. The latter, the juvenile justice system reformed in 1945 in France, was based on the expertise of the psychological sciences, which tended to interpret this type of demand as the expression of a pathological desire, that is emancipation. This kind of justice system also set out to restore paternal authority at the end of the war, which it was said had destroyed the family. We will discuss the application of this measure of paternal correction in the post-war period between 1945 and 1958, when it was abolished and transformed into a measure of educational assistance. We will see that far from becoming extinct, that far from disappearing like an obsolete right, paternal correction allows more than ever in these years of youth emancipation to control the bodies of the bad girls. So there are going to be two parts in my talk. First, the paternal correction, a gendered legal provision, and second, expertise and subjectivity at the Good Shepherd Reform School in Angers. Okay. From the 19th century onwards, the civil courts in France has allowed fathers to have their offspring locked up under the heading of paternal correction, a measure which took up the principle of the letters of cachet, lettres de cachet of the old regime. Any insubordinate minor child could be thrown into state prison or the convents of the Madeleine by his father on a simple request to the civil court. No reason for paternal discontent was required to justify the confinement of children. This measure was applied in a very gendered way. While underage girls were rare in the criminal justice system in the 19th and 20th century, they were common in the civil courts under the paternal correction. After the decline of the measure after the First World War, the paternal correction was extensively revised in 1935, giving the magistrate more power over the father's will. And rather than dying out, the paternal correction returned to the forefront of the legal tools of juvenile justice in the process of being refounded after the Second World War in France. Indeed, with the ordinance of the 1st of September 1945, the paternal correction returned to the hands of the new children's judge, juvenile judge, which meant that its function changed. It was no longer to be the arbitrary procedure by which a father decided on the fate of his children, but rather an educational measure supposed to benefit young people. The principle of a social investigation prior to a judicial decision was also introduced. This is after the war, in order to avoid the alleged misuses of certain families. The paternal correction thus becomes one of the vectors for the intrusion of social services into family intimacy, a tool for subtle regulation of the working classes, since although they asked for intervention, they were under the microscope of experts and must be accountable to the courts. An important point is that the juvenile judge has the power to have the child placed in an institution for the duration of the investigation in order to gather more precise information about the young people themselves. As we shall see, this was the way in which the practice of medical and pedagogical observation was to spread in the post-war years. At the end of this investigation, the judges decided, after hearing all the parties, including the young person, and he has the power to place the child not for a maximum of 6 months as previously provided for in the civil code, but until the minor reaches the age of majority. The judge is supposed to modulate theoretically this period according to the degree of amendment of the minor. From 1950 onwards, the statistics of the éducation surveillée, the supervisory education, which is the administration for institution of reform schools in France, the statistics recorded the paternal correction measures. In 1951, they represented more than 1,000 measures for the whole of France, for about 15,000 cases of delinquency. By the end of the 1950s, this measure had more than doubled, with more than 2,500 whole measure per year for nearly 4,000 requests from families. This increase in requests confirms the hypothesis that working class families endorse juvenile justice as it was reconfigured in 1945 in France. Okay. A striking feature of the statistics is the gender issue. Even more than in the 19th century, the paternal correction was a gendered measure. Girls who were in the minority when it comes to delinquency, from 10% to 15% in the 50s, depending of the year. On the year, girls were in the majority when it comes to paternal correction measures, as it can be seen in this graph. What is at stake behind the success of the paternal correction measures is the new possibility offered to French juvenile justice system to intervene outside the traditional criminal field with civil measures of so-called protection. This development is in line with the philosophy of juvenile justice that has emerged since the beginning of the 20th century in industrialized countries, reform that France had partly skirted. And the philosophy of this reform was to emphasize the preventive and protective dimension of justice toward youth. Together with protective measures for vagrancy, which is another civil measure, paternal correction was the legal tool in the hands of the juvenile judge to deal with cases at an early stage before commission of an offense was made, and in accordance with the idea that action must be taken both on the children and on the family environment. It is also in the name of this judicial protection that young girls come under the thumb of the juvenile justice system to a much greater extent, with the general idea that it is a matter of protecting them from their environment, which is considered corrupting, especially for girls, but also protecting them from themselves. We will see why and how through the case of the Good Shepherd of Angers. The community of Notre-Dame de la Charité du Bon Pasteur, which is the full name of the Good Shepherd, was founded in Angers in 1835 with the very idea of taking care of the lost girls of the working classes by setting up in the heart of industrial cities. Very quickly, this congregation became the gendered pillar of re-education, not only in France, with nearly 80 institutions in the middle of the 20th century, but worldwide with about 2,070 institutions abroad. In the post-war years, the Good Shepherd's network further strengthens its presence in juvenile justice. Although the public sector had set up several institutions to take in young girls deemed to be very difficult, the Good Shepherd remained the leading network in terms of capacity. This was the golden age of large, closed, austere boarding schools for boys and girls, but with a total domination of this type of institution for girls, while boys benefited more and more from open environment measure, mesure en milieu ouvert in French. This undisputed domination of boarding schools continued until the end of the 60s. And for girls, the conventual model remained prevalent, with the persistent idea of the need for moral redemption for girls who were deemed to be at fault, even if they did not come under the criminal justice system, as in the case of the paternal correction. Indeed, in line with national trend, the share of girls under civil measure, and in particular paternal correction, is significant and even increasing in the Good Shepherd of Angers. As you can see on this graph, the measure of paternal correction are in gray on this graph, and it grows over the year in the post-war years. In view of these figures, more than a third of the girls admitted to the Good Shepherd during this period came under a paternal correction measure, with the proportion increasing in the 1950s to become the majority. A large proportion, around 50% of these girls interned by paternal correction, were previously placed under medical pedagogical observation, so as to carry out not only a social investigation on the family, but also a thorough personality investigation on the girls placed. Indeed, even more than in cases of delinquency, the paternal correction is concerned with behavior deemed problematic on the part of the girls, among which the desire for emancipation from the family is prominent. The reason for intervention recorded in the registers and files of the Good Shepherd of Angers mention, for example, misconduct, insubordination, behavioral problems, family difficulties, and so on. Indeed, the rise of the psychological sciences in the post-war years transformed the very etiology of family disorders and problematized juvenile misbehavior and insubordination as behavioral disorders. Mental hygiene, as they called, which are consultation, became widespread in the 50s. Families resorted to this type of consultation on their own initiative or on the advice of various people, school teachers, parish priests, family doctors, etc. And these day consultations carried out a rapid assessment and offered recommended placement in residential observation, which led family to request a paternal correction to juvenile justice. The girls were then placed in temporary care for an average of 3 months. They were subjected to a series of various tests, firstly psychometric tests, IQ tests, for example, but also so-called projective tests, like the Rorschach test, for example, which are supposed to give a more qualitative assessment of their psychological state. They were constantly observed by educators, psychologists who have been trained in a very precise methodology. The qualitative analysis of these cases reveals several recurring narratives. First, the investigation frequently reveals a strong family disagreement, the origin of which is attributed to the girls who are deemed incorrigible. These conflicts lead to successive placement for the young people, whether within the family itself, religious boarding schools, apprenticeships, placement as domestic servant, or stays in various care institutions. A large number of girls run away from their homes or placement in the post-war years, which justified more coercive institutional placement. The feeling emerged of a great instability for the young people, permanently displaced, and of which the Good Shepherd seems to be the end point, the institutional end point. Second, part of this conflict stemmed from controversies between young people and their parents over the family financial resources. In a classic pattern, some young girls refused to bring all their income home, in particular to take advantage of the leisure activities that were available to young people in the 50s, cinema, dance, fanfare, etc. And in the context of the development of a consumer society. So that was a big problem. Third, another part of the conflicts are the so-called misconduct of girls, and a euphemism for reprehensible sexual behavior. Young girls were denounced as being, and I quote, precocious, immoral, and even in the eye of psychiatry, incapable of curbing their sexual impulses. That is often called hysteria, for example. This grievance was frequently reinforced by the suspicion of homosexuality in boarding schools, with archives files frequently highlighting the equivocal behavior of girls among themselves. Moreover, in the institution, they did not respect their gender assignment, showing opposition, aggressiveness, and even violence. The survey, the reports in the institution also reveals parental incompetence, which was more often attributed to mothers, while fathers were often described as alcoholic and violent. They were given excuses. On the other hand, mothers were blamed for failing to maintain a good family atmosphere, a good hygiene in the home, good emotional relationships within the household. The material management, but also the economy of affects within the families was their responsibility. And their daughters were supposed to be the victims of this, but also to participate in the bad family atmosphere described in many social reports. Social investigation and psychological tests were very frequently revealed family violence, especially paternal violence, while the justice system was very intrusive in some respect. We can see here the inability to deal with sexual violence and in particular incest, even though this type of act is explicitly mentioned in the testimonies of the interviewees. Even though it may be seen paradoxical, highlighting the psychological dimension of family relationship did not put an end to the incest taboo. On the contrary, the psychological approach reinforced in the post-war years the suspicion of immorality associated with a psychological disorder or even psychoanalytical interpretation, dismissing the reality of facts about incest. In the case of young girls who have the courage to denounce their abusive father. They were not taken, their testimonies were not really be taken into account. Generally speaking, the observation phase was an opportunity to transfer a certain number of family problems onto the girls by psychologizing them. This process led to a reinforcement of a gendered reading of juvenile deviance within the family. Firstly, because according to social workers, family conflicts were more harmful to girls than to boys. And secondly, because the educational difficulties encountered by parents were attributed to psychological problems more frequently highlighted in girls, in particular their inability to respect paternal authority. Finally, because girls were associated with a problematic or pathological corporality, which put family reproduction at risk. Thus, the vast majority of cases were followed by long-term institutionalization, and not by a solution of allowing for return to the family. The Good Shepherd's network then has many possibilities for placement in boarding schools, depending on the young people's profiles and disposition, but which largely compromised their ambition for social emancipation. Indeed, this institution remained extremely stigmatizing and did not provide any real vocational training, as you can see on this photograph. This institution offered the majority of young people servile tasks such as laundry or sewing, for example. Moreover, it is not uncommon for the girls to opt for a transfer to psychiatric asylum, for example, as in the case of Emilienne mentioned in the introduction to this paper. In the face of this judicial and institutional process of restriction of their freedom, girls have spoken out and protested more and more conspicuously in the post-war years. Their voices were no longer stifled behind the high walls of convents, while the psychological sciences gave them a voice with the intention of revealing their intimacy. The girls seized this space for expression to express their uneasiness, their questions, and even their anger. As a tool of normalization and discipline, their expertise contributed to the girls' awareness of their own subjectivity and even of their rights. And I therefore end this presentation as I began it with an individual case story that of Anne-Marie, a case which, like Emilienne's, echoes the post-colonial context in which France found itself in the 1960s. The case of Anne-Marie illustrates this gap between the situation as perceived by the experts and the way in which the girls reclaim their history. Anne-Marie, whose father was a French soldier and her mother a Vietnamese young woman, was deemed to be sexually precocious due to early puberty. Arrested by the Paris police when she ran away from her father's home, her father asked that she be placed in paternal correction. She was sent to Angers for observation. The psychiatric report indicated a precocious development because she was, and I quote, mixed blood. And the report said, I quote, Anne-Marie is an adolescent with disharmonic development, partly due to a somatic prematuration caused by her racial origins, end quote. According to the expert, this explained her so-called misconduct and her willingness to run away from to satisfy her, and I quote, sexual needs. In contrast to this atavistic theory, the girl expressed her dreams of freedom through the free writings, les rédactions, that the psychologist asked her to do. And this rédaction said, and I quote, and then one day I was caught by the cops like a stray dog, and I was locked up. But I could not stand this. I liked this life too much. Then I ran away once again, and I was once again locked up. I traveled from place to place. I was hungry, but I was happy. Now, on my 16th birthday, I am jailed again. Yet I was, and I will always be, a beatnik. Thank you for your attention.